This lesson is going to focus on Gilded Age politics. The title Gilded Age itself suggests that the social and political atmospheres of the late 19th and early 20th centuries looked nice on the surface, but were fake or tarnished under the surface. We saw a lot of this in our last lesson on social issues, where even though we have unprecedented growth in the cities and industry, the realities of the city living were less than great. This is why we needed muckrakers and other reformers like Jane Addams. In this video, we'll focus more on the political side of reform and the Gilded Age. There are three main components of Gilded Age politics that we need to be aware of in order to understand the period more fully. The first component is well-defined voting blocks. When you see the word block, think of a group of people who are united by certain principles. So during the Gilded Age, we have two voting blocks, Democrats and Republicans. Democrats tended to be white Southerners who wanted to continue the preservation of white supremacy. They were also Catholics, immigrants, including Catholics, but obviously also Jews, the urban working poor, and most farmers. Republicans tended to be Northern whites who were pro-business, African Americans, Northern Protestants, and anti-immigrant supporters, also known as nativists. It also included the bulk of the white middle class. These categories were pretty strict during the Gilded Age, so not a lot of people crossed to the other side. As a result, voters were extremely loyal to their party at the polls. The second component is a laissez-faire federal government. The idea of the do-little government was in tune with two other popular ideas of the time, laissez-faire or hands-off economics and social Darwinism. Furthermore, the federal courts were very narrowly interpreting the government's powers to regulate business, and this limited the impact of the few laws that Congress did pass. Overall, the government's position was limited to the few duties that you see here and the doling out of Civil War pensions or paychecks to veterans. The third component is pretty closely tied to the second. With the federal government doing little to regulate many political and economic aspects of society, the role of the president became more symbolic than active. As a result, party bosses like Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall were able to take over local and state governments and control voter participation and economic development. Additionally, the presidents during the Gilded Age tried to step lightly around the major issues of their time because they didn't want to offend the factions that they were having within their parties and cause them to vote for someone else. They also handed out government jobs and contracts to those individuals who did support them. This wasn't a new concept or privilege for the president, but in the 25-year period between 1865 and 1890, the number of federal employees essentially tripled. This isn't to say that there was absolutely nothing going on in the political life of America during the Gilded Age. In fact, there were several key issues that were hotly debated throughout the era. One of the first issues was civil service reform. We'll talk more about this on our next slide, but essentially, the federal government found out pretty quickly that many federal jobs shouldn't be given out based on party support. The second issue centered on money. If you remember back to the Civil War era, in order to pay for the rising cost of the war, both the Union and Confederacy chose to print greenbacks or paper money. While this solved the money issue temporarily, it led to a massive inflation for both sides. After the war's end, the federal government attempted to solve this issue by returning to the gold standard, which means they only wanted to issue the amount of money that could be backed up by the gold they had stored in the federal vault. However, this transition hurt many farmers and other rural individuals who depended on either greenbacks or silver as their only money supply. These groups petitioned for the government to return to allowing paper money and the unlimited minting or making of silver coins. They were usually fought by big businessmen in urban areas and the politicians who benefited from their corruption, who wanted to make sure that the gold standard was the only standard used. Finally, we have the undying issue of the protective tariff. I'm kind of hoping that you guys will get an essay on this on the AP exam since we've talked about it so much that you would have a really good synthesis point. But as we already know, protective tariffs are good for big business. They tend to make it harder for other countries to sell their goods to America and therefore make it more likely that Americans will buy domestic goods. However, as we saw most recently with the Civil War, tariffs aren't very good for farmers because farmers rely on a lot of manufactured goods in order to survive from day to day. This means that many of the goods they buy have to come from overseas manufacturers, which means they'll be paying more for them. The imbalance of the positive effects for industry and negative effects for farmers became more and more apparent during the Gilded Age, as America saw unprecedented growth in industry. So that's more or less a survey of the political climate we're talking about in the Gilded Age. Now let's get into some of the specifics. The easiest way to do this is by examining each of the presidents during that period and what they did. First, we have the election of James Garfield. In order to understand fully what happened here, we have to talk about the division that happened within the Republican Party prior to his election. As we already know, during the Reconstruction period, the Republican Party fell under some serious corruption with patronage and spoils. As part of this, the Republican Party split into three factions. Two of those factions competed with each other for patronage and government jobs. The liberal faction, called the half-breeds because they were only considered half Republican, backed the previous president Hayes in his lenient treatment of the South and the Compromise of 1877. They also supported civil service reform for government employees. They were bitterly opposed to the stalwarts, the conservative faction, who opposed Hayes and did not like civil service reform. In the election of 1880, Republicans compromised by nominating half-breed James Garfield as president and stalwart Chester Arthur as vice president. However, in his first weeks in office, a disagreement about who received a government job led one bitter and deranged stalwart to shoot Garfield in the back as he was boarding a train for summer vacation. Ouch. After struggling with the wound for 11 weeks, Garfield died. Our third faction, the Mugwumps, refused to play the patronage game at all. The name came after they were ridiculed for sitting on the fence with their mugs or faces on one side and wumps or bottoms on the other. Garfield's assassination was a pretty big red flag to the federal government, who realized that something had to be done in terms of civil service reform so that a similar incident wouldn't happen again. When his vice president, Chester Arthur, took over, Congress passed the Pendleton Act of 1881, which set up the Civil Service Commission and created a system by which applicants for classified federal jobs would be selected based on their scores on a competitive exam and not their loyalty to their party. It also prohibited civil servants, so government employees, from taking political contributions or money in an effort to keep them unbiased. When he tried for his own election in 1884, the Mugwump Republicans refused to nominate him as their candidate because they thought he wouldn't do enough to correct the corruption that they fought so hard against. However, they also had little faith in the man that the Republican Party did decide to nominate, Senator James Blaine, so many of them chose instead to vote for Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat. With the support of a number of Republicans, in addition to the numbers from his own party, Cleveland won the election. This made him the first president since the Civil War that was a Democrat. He's also notable for being the only president to ever serve his 2 terms non-consecutively. His first term was marked by 3 political stances. First, he believed in a small government in the same way that Thomas Jefferson did. As part of this, he was unwilling to give federal aid to rich or poor people. Second, he provided no help for laborers or unions. When several people were killed in the Haymarket riot of 1886, he did nothing to calm the public anger against the laborers involved in the strike. And when the Pullman Railroad workers went on strike during Cleveland's second term, he sent in the army to break up the strike, using the excuse that they were interfering with the delivery of the mail. Finally, Cleveland supported reduced tariffs. While he supported the idea of protective tariffs in general, he considered the price of the tariffs that they already had as too high. Cleveland's first term also saw the introduction of 2 extremely important laws. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 set up the Interstate Commerce Commission that was, and still is, responsible for handling complaints about or issues with companies that cross state lines. They made sure that the large businesses weren't illegally attempting to swindle farmers and small merchants out of tons of money. He also passed the Dawes Act in 1887, which broke up native tribal lands into individual plots for small farming. The idea behind this was that if the natives were forced to adopt white American farming and living situations, they would eventually be forced to abandon their native cultures, and then the government wouldn't have to pay to keep up reservations anymore. However, because the Native Americans weren't accustomed to the type of farming required of them, and because passing down land to multiple children meant smaller and smaller plots per person, the Dawes Act ultimately failed. In 1888, the primary election issue was the tariff. Democrats, meaning Cleveland, campaigned for a lower tariff. Republicans ran presidential candidate Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, and campaigned for a higher tariff. The Republican argument was that a lower tariff would wreck business prosperity by allowing foreign goods to flood the market. They played on this fear to raise campaign funds from big businesses and to rally workers in the North whose jobs depended on that industry. They also attacked Cleveland's vetoes of veterans' pension bills as a mean of attacking his character. At the end of the election, although Cleveland received the most popular votes, Harrison swept the North and gained the majority of the Electoral College votes. The election of 1888 demonstrated a dramatic shift in American public opinion about the role of the federal government. Whereas in years past they had wanted the government to stay out of business ventures, now they wanted the federal government to deal with growing social and economic issues and to curb the power of trusts or monopolies. Thus, the passage of laws like the Interstate Commerce Act, which we just discussed, and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which broke up large trusts into smaller businesses, were a successful step in the direction of popular opinion. The McKinley Tariff, passed by Republicans during Harrison's term in office, also raised the rate of tariffs another 4% to protect American businesses. This, however, became wildly unpopular and caused the Republican Party to suffer large losses in the congressional elections during 1890. One of the biggest changes in politics that we see during the Gilded Age is the introduction of the Populist Party, which was more or less the first serious third party in American history. Populists thought that the government should cater to the needs of ordinary people, not just rich businessmen. They complained that the growth of corporate power had corrupted the government in favor of these industrial giants. What they wanted was a strong federal government that was willing to step in and protect the common man's interests in the economy. Unsurprisingly, this attack on big business came primarily from farmers and sharecroppers. If you recall the Grangers from Chapter 16, many of the issues that they petitioned to change became part of the populist platform. At their convention held in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892, the Populists developed a platform of several issues. I'm not going to read them all since they're listed here, but you should make a point to pause the video and write them down, especially those that are bolded. You should notice, however, that all of these issues benefit small farmers and common people. They called for the direct election of senators, a power that used to be in the hands of state legislatures, in order to prevent corruption in state politicians from simply electing their friends or business partners. They also wanted the remonetization of silver because they couldn't afford to live under the gold standard. We'll discuss these issues more in class since they'll definitely show up on your test. Displeasure over the way that Harrison ran the government during his presidency led to a second win for Cleveland during the election of 1892. If you look at the pie chart for the popular vote, you'll notice that the Populist Party's vote took a significant amount, almost 10%, of votes from the two big parties. This was really the first time that a third party had gotten that significant of a lead against the Democrats and Republicans. Shortly after Cleveland returned to office, though, several major corporations went bankrupt. This led to a crash in the stock market and subsequent bank failures. Without the bank to give loans to farms and businesses alike, many farmers lost their land and businesses were forced to fire thousands of people. Despite this great loss, Cleveland, who, if you recall from earlier, didn't believe in providing help for people, went against public opinion and refused to bail out anyone from their financial problems. As a result of the Panic of 1893, thousands of unemployed men marched to Washington to convince lawmakers that something had to be done to help the American people. They demanded that the government create public works projects like building roads and parks as a way of opening new jobs for those who had lost them in factories and other businesses. But Cleveland remained unsympathetic to their cries. Rather than meet their needs, he had Coxey arrested for trespassing and forced the remainder of the protesters to return home. These policies made Cleveland extremely unpopular super fast. He was blamed for the financial panic and criticized for his support of the gold standard. He was also criticized for using federal troops to break up the Pullman strike in 1894 and for making poor financial choices. During the election of 1896, the issue over the gold standard divided the Democratic Party. Democrats who supported the gold standard supported Republican candidate William McKinley, and those who supported the introduction of silver as common currency backed the Populists, who had campaigned against the gold standard as one of their primary issues. The populist candidate, William Jennings Bryan, was already a public figurehead for his part in the Scopes monkey trial over evolution, and was a proven powerful speaker. He used his ability to his advantage, traveling across the country delivering speeches like his famous Cross of Gold speech. McKinley counteracted this by spending tons of money on advertisements and offering Americans a promising future after the Panic of 1893. In the end, prosperity and money won. This was quite a shock for most people who assumed that Bryan's popularity and support from half the Democrats would make him the winning candidate. However, he lost because his focus on abolishing the gold standard alienated urban workers who depended on industry, which itself depended on the gold standard, for their jobs. He also did little to reach out to other interest groups and had poor organization for his advertisements. So in the end, McKinley won the election of 1896. This video has been a general overview of politics of the Gilded Age. In our next video, we're going to focus on the Progressive Era, the other half of Chapter 20, and the political issues that came out of that and were solved by that era.